Thank you all for joining. My name is Kent Matsumoto, and I'm going to moderate this panel. I'm going to do this alphabetically so that there are no hard feelings. I'm going to introduce each of the authors. Each of the authors will have an opportunity to talk about a question that we have planted with each of them, and then I've got questions for each of the authors. However, what I do not want to make this is a talking forum of four heads going one down after another and then Alden on the screen. So I'll try and mix it up, and we will hopefully have time for questions, building time in for questions before our 10 o'clock end time. At 10 o'clock, we will adjourn because this room needs to be converted to something else. And then we, except for Alden, will be out in the lobby signing books, selling books. And we hope you will stop by and have a chance to chat with each of you. So, with that, Sophie, good morning. Sophie Ali Khan. Sophie is here, delighted to have you, Sophie. Her parents emigrated from Pakistan to America, believing that America would be a good country, which happens to be the title of her book. She has pursued a career in social justice, and she has worked and worshiped and lived in 12 different countries across towns across the nation. And after 9/11 and after the 2016 election, she felt that her dream, family's dream, came under threat, constant threat. And so her book largely captures that, equal parts memoir, current events, and a vital portrait of our nation, its people, and its pathways towards a better future. Welcome, Sophie. Kimiko Guthrie is here with us, and she is not only here by herself, but she's with her mother and her two daughters. Welcome. This is wonderful to have three generations. Kimiko is a dancer by profession, grew up in Berkeley, California, BA in creative writing, and dance from UC Santa Cruz. Block 17, which you can see in front of her, is her debut novel, and it is inspired by her experiences growing up with a mother who's here in the audience, who was incarcerated at Rohrer, and it explores the trauma, especially the unspoken trauma, how it's inherited across generations. Welcome, Kimiko.
Thank you.
On the screen, Alden, can you wave and let me know that you can hear us? Wonderful. Alden also has a novel, which Alden, you're welcome to hold it up. Two Nails, One Love. The story begins with the character reuniting with his mother, who is visiting from Hawaii, and the son, who is in New York. Again, this is in the novel. Mother was imprisoned in Jerome, Rohrer, and deported to Hiroshima. Mother, the character in the book. The son in the book has forsaken a career in music, delayed coming out during the AIDS epidemic, and over the time that the mother spends with the son in New York City, they come to understand their complex and subtle ways that their lives are both intertwined as well as in conflict. Alden has a master's in journalism from Boston University. He has worked for very prestigious organizations, Scientific American and the Harvard Business Review. And last, alphabetically, is my wife Connie, and she and I have our debut novel. We wrote it together. It is grounded in historical accuracy, but it is historical fiction. And it's historical fiction inspired by my parents' lives. My mother incarcerated in Jerome, as I said, my father, who is a Hiroshima bomb survivor. Yet they were separated by the Pacific, yet they came together. They believed in the American dream together, and they have their conflict, which you can read about in our novel. Connie is a native Marylander with a bachelor's from Notre Dame University of Maryland, a master's in business from Johns Hopkins University. She has a creative streak, and she's been an interior designer and an HR professional. So welcome, Connie, to the panel, and thank you everybody for joining. Thank you for that warm welcome, everybody. It's going to be the same question for everyone, so I don't want everybody to think that there's trick questions here. Again, alphabetically, the question is, what inspired your book? What was the inspiration for your novel? And we will start, Sophie, with you.
So, thank you all for having me, first of all. Can everyone hear me? I'm short and I'm quiet, so I'm going to stand up. So in 2015, I was the mom to 2 young children, 3 and 5 years old, and my husband and I had just moved back from Chicagoland to Bucks County, Pennsylvania, to be close to my parents. My parents are immigrants from Pakistan, and so it was kind of our dream to be 3 generations all in one place. And we were delighted to be there, and then Trump started to campaign. And you'll remember that his campaign focused pretty unabashedly on the total and complete shutdown of Muslims in the United States. And my family is Muslim. So I was, as a young mother, trying to grapple with what this meant for my family. And it wasn't new to me that Muslims were being racialized. I was practicing as a social justice lawyer I had been practicing as a social justice lawyer for 15 years by then. And I had helped start the Council on American Islamic Relations in Philadelphia, the largest civil rights organization for Muslims in the country. So it's not that do I need to review any of that, or is it okay? So it's not that I didn't understand what was going on, it's that suddenly the big shift was that it was coming from the state. This wasn't private animus. It wasn't that someone looked at us funny on the street or a shopkeeper refused to serve us. It was that from the presidential campaign podium, and then from the presidential podium itself, we were being targeted. And so what I realized was that my conviction that the moral arc bent inevitably towards justice was challenged. Even though I'd been working in low-income communities of color for 15 years, I realized I had to take another, deeper look at the 12 American towns in which I'd lived and figure out where the color lines that I was always tripping over had come from. And so one of those towns was Little Rock, Arkansas, where I moved right after college to be a community organizer. I found myself at the Women's Project with Judy Matsuoka, who's here. And so when I was thinking through the color lines I wanted to examine in Little Rock, it was Central High, the history that everyone can attach to. But then the second chapter of that attempted desegregation, which was the building of Highway 630 to resegregate the town so that high schools and schools all across the town would be resegregated, de facto desegregated, because the town itself would be split. And then I found myself wondering, because when I was in Little Rock, I was the only brown face. I saw black faces and I saw white faces, and then I saw Judy in my faces. And I was trying to figure out what Judy Matsuoka was doing in Little Rock. And so with that research question in mind, I went looking for Judy 25 years later. And Judy was kind enough to tell me her family's story, which I recount in A Good Country. I also, in that search, found Kimiko, because of an article she had written, and she connected me with Rinko Shimasaki, who, along with her daughter Eileen, were willing to let me interview them and tell a little bit of their family stories. So really, the inspiration for A Good Country was collecting these incredible stories of brown and black Americans all over the country to try and understand what their stories meant for my own children in America.
Thank you, Sofia. Why don't we pass the mic that way to Kimiko? Again, the question is, what was the inspiration for your book?
Okay. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? First of all, thank you just for this whole event, Kimiko and everyone, Erin, everyone who's been organizing. It's just such an honor to be here for me, for my daughters, to be here with my mom. So yeah, for Block 17, the inspiration for me was growing up in Berkeley in the 1970s. I heard many sort of bits and fragments about camp, just as everyday life with my mom, and then visiting all our family in LA. They would almost cheerfully often recollect, experiences at Rower, walking through the woods, and time at the river, more downtime with their parents. So in a way, I thought of it as this summer camp, this kind of pleasant summer camp, but then also I would hear the barbed wire, the armed men, the no dogs or Japs signs in town, and having to leave their family's hotel in 10 days. So my experience growing up of this place called camp was very sort of fragmented and shards coming through. So that's what I wanted to convey when I wrote my story. I didn't feel comfortable trying to sort of represent my mom's experience or my uncles and aunts' experience firsthand. I wanted to represent what I knew, which was this fragmented experience of camp. And also because that's sort of the nature of trauma. And my mom actually grew up to become a trauma therapist to sort of understand what had happened to her and to help others work through similar types of oppression and internalized oppression. But with trauma, we don't sort of experience it as a linear, cohesive narrative, because the very nature of trauma breaks up our identity, our experience. So in my novel, I wanted to sort of utilize the surreal and the illogical. Sometimes the story is not linear or logical, to sort of capture that experience, especially from the lens of a child going through something like that, which my mom was a child when she experienced it. And the other thing that I wanted to say that inspired me was I wanted to explore not only the trauma that I would hear about, but the inability to talk about trauma and how that can affect us. And while my mother was actually quite vocal about it, a lot of the elders in our community did not want to talk about camp at all, and that was something that I heard time again, this sort of silence around camp. And I used to think, well, that's human nature, just to sort of suppress the unpleasant, which I think is partly true. And then I also attributed it to some Japanese cultural phenomenon such as gaman, shikataganai, the sense of bearing the unbearable with strength and dignity, which I think is also true. But what I didn't know was how our community was forcibly silenced. I think people here, more than any other audience I'll probably ever talk to, understand this firsthand, but how the FBI, right after Pearl Harbor, swept through the community, took away the leaders, raided homes, this type of terror in the community, showing the whole community that if you dare to speak out, you will be punished. And people didn't know where these men were being taken, for how long. That was terrorizing. So that silence wasn't something that our community did to ourselves. It was enforced from the outside. So that was sort of new for me as I grew older, understanding that, and I wanted to have that in my book. So my main character, the trauma that she inherits really stems from her grandfather being taken by the FBI right after Pearl Harbor. Thank you.
Kimiko, thank you. We're going to move alphabetically to Alden. Alden, what inspired your book?
Yeah, so first off, I want to apologize for not being able to be there physically. I play in an orchestra, and we have a concert tonight in Boston, and I thought just being in Arkansas and then flying back, it would have been just too much. So I'm sorry, because this pilgrimage has a very special place in my heart. Kimiko knows, I was on this pilgrimage 4 years ago in 2019, and I had wanted to visit the site of where my mother and her family were incarcerated at Jerome. I'd wanted to do it for so long, and I had wanted my mother to come with me. I wanted us to go together, but when I asked her years ago, if we could do this, she looked at me like I was crazy, and she said, why in the world would I ever want to, take one step back in that state? And no offense to anybody from Arkansas there. It's just, my mother's history there. But anyway, I went by myself on the pilgrimage 4 years ago. I met Kimiko Mar, and I met Rinko. And I don't know how many of you attended the Survivors session last night. I watched it, and oh my God, to see Rinko again, because I met her and we talked, and she remembered my mother. This is after 75 years, because my mother and Rinko are same age. They're both Year of the Rabbit, and they were in school together. And Rinko remembered my mother. I was just blown away, that 75 years ago, she would remember my mother. And I think she remembered my mother because my mother was from Hawaii, which was unusual. But that really had such an impact on me. And I had wanted to write about my mother's experience during the war for a very long time. And Kimi, I was like you, where these shards of memory, like things would come back, and I could never quite organize in my mind what it all meant and all. But the more I researched, the more I understood, and I wanted to write, but I wasn't sure what to write. At first, I started writing nonfiction. That didn't quite work. And then I went on the pilgrimage, and there I was, in Arkansas. I actually visited the site, Jerome, where my mother was incarcerated. I actually talked to Rinko, who remembered my mother and being in high school together. And that inspired me. And that I was hell-bent. I was going to finish this book. I just had to. I had been procrastinating too long. And I made a promise to myself, I was going to finish it. And I did. So, thank you. And as I said, this pilgrimage has a very, very special place in my heart. So, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Alden. Alden, before I leave you and turn it over to Connie, what is your mother's name? Oh,
Yamane. And, Ken, I don't know how old your mother was. My mother was 16 when she entered camp. Is quite possibly our mothers knew each other.
So thank you, Alden. We'll get your mother's in. Connie, what was the inspiration for your book?
What a weird question coming from you. But I will answer it for the benefit of everyone here. Good morning, everyone. And our thanks to Kimiko and the team for all of the hard work and dedication to putting this event together. Thank you for including us. So the inspiration for Of White Ashes began actually 27 years ago when Kent and I were on our first date at the Baltimore Museum of Art. We were there to see a Dale Chihuly glass exhibit, and the precursor exhibit was a photography exhibit of Dorothea Lange's work. And I was standing there admiring the very famous picture of the little girl with a tag around her neck, holding her little suitcase, waiting to go off to camp. And Kent came up behind me and said, "That was my mother's story." Well, I got shivers. And a few hours later, after we saw the glass exhibit, we went to lunch, and then he told me his dad's story. His dad, an American citizen who went to Hiroshima as a baby and survived the bombing of his city. And I thought then how remarkable it was that these two individuals came together, but I didn't know them then. I didn't even know him then. But I said, that's a remarkable story, and that's a book. But I wasn't a writer. I was a business person, and I never imagined that I would co-author this book. And I don't think that Ken did either. And so over the years, we were married a few years later. I got to know and love Ken's parents, Reiko and Isao Matsumoto. And it's interesting that they would share their stories with me, stories that they hadn't shared with their children. And I was very inquisitive. Reiko would give me books and very gently over time share her stories of camp and of her years in Hawaii and what it was like when her father was arrested the day after Pearl Harbor. And the same with Kent's dad. And I felt very honored to be the person to hear these stories. They also shared the stories with Kent's brother's wife, Lisa, who is also white. And so it's interesting how that dynamic came together, but I'm so grateful to them. And we tried several different ways to bring this story to life. We hired a nonfiction writer who had a wonderful reputation in Maryland, introduced him to Kent's parents, and they were actually quite rude to him. They said, no, we don't want to talk about this, we're not going to talk to you, let's eat lunch. And then a few years later, we introduced a documentary filmmaker from California to them, and they were warming to the idea. The crew had assembled, they were about to come to Virginia where Kent's parents lived, and then they changed their minds. And so the years ticked by, and Kent's mom passed in 2016. And it was the next year that we decided to collaborate on this book together. And here it is, it's Of White Ashes. It is a novel, but it is based on the experiences of these two people who I will love forever.
A bit of insight into each of the authors' inspiration for the book. Let's slightly shift over to the writing and the process, because again, you're welcome, and we hope you will read the novels, but we have an opportunity here with each of us on the panel here in Alden by phone. So I'm going to ask this next question of Kimiko. Kimiko, what challenges did you face in writing Block 17?
Thank you. Lots of challenges. I'm trying to narrow it down, but I think one of my main challenges in terms of the writing process was, as I mentioned, I wanted my main character to experience camp the way I did, in these sort of shards and fragments. And so the main character, whose name is Jane, she also has a Japanese name, Akiko, but she goes by Jane. She's very cut off from her own emotions and her own experience of the trauma that's actually haunting her, because she doesn't know what happened exactly. I don't want to give spoilers, but there's a particular event in camp that really traumatized her mother. So Jane is quite actively haunted by that event, but doesn't know about it. So it was challenging for me just to convey, I wanted to convey to the reader what had happened, and it's told from the Jane's point of view, because I wanted the reader to experience her perspective. But at the same time, how could I tell the reader what Jane herself doesn't know? So she's a very unreliable narrator, which I've always loved in fiction. I like, sort of as the reader, having this space between who this person thinks they are and who they are. But it was still challenging to convey enough that a reader would connect with Jane when she is disconnected from herself. So that was a challenge. And I got lots of feedback, from friends, and then eventually my agent, who said, I really love this novel, but Jane is so sort of alienating. How can we make her a little more accessible to the reader while still being true to who she is? So that was sort of tricky. And then another challenge was just getting it published. I had never been, I had a short story published right out of college, but I had no connections to the publishing industry. So, but I have a lot of connections in the dance theater world, and I thought, it'll be easy. I'll just sort of do some networking and get it published. So I wrote the novel pretty much all together, thought it was finished, and then really quickly realized I didn't have any connections, or what I thought were connections weren't very useful. So I was just cold emailing agents for 2 years. I was just telling Sofia I got over 50 rejection. It became like a daily meditation, a rejection a day. Every day I get a rejection. And then I heard, maybe some of you know Viet Thanh Nguyen. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning Vietnamese American author of The Sympathizer. I was just ready to give up and say, maybe this isn't going to happen. And then I heard him on probably Fresh Air or something say, don't give up, the publishing industry is a very still white, mainstream world, even though that's changing, but there are these sort of gatekeepers, not really by design, not each of them aren't, saying, oh, this is a story that I don't want to publish because it's not told from a white perspective, but nevertheless, many of them don't relate, and that is what I heard from a lot of agents. Oh, I love your story, but I don't really relate to this character or this story. But he was giving advice saying, don't try to translate for that mainstream audience, right, as though you are the center, and eventually, eventually you'll get published. And so I just kept at it, for 2 years. Finally, I found this amazing agent who, related to this story, not because it was her personal experience, but just at a human level, and she helped me to edit it. So I feel very blessed that I finally found that agent and was able to have the book published. But it was not an easy.
Kimiko, thank you.
Thank you.
That's certainly for those who in the audience are already published. I'm sure those comments resonate as they do with Connie and me, and I'm sure Sofia and Alden. But I'm actually going to ask Connie for giving advice to aspiring writers who want to become authors. What some of the advice that you have?
Do it. And don't be afraid to do it. There's so many different pathways to telling your story. And if you decide to take on a full-length book like we did, I would suggest find your supporters, reach out to writing organizations in the communities where you live, talk to your librarian, ask your librarian if there's a writing group at the library, where you can surround yourself with people who can read your work and critique your work. And also, I spend as much time as you spend writing, understanding the publishing industry. As Kimiko mentioned, it's the beast, and it's very difficult to maneuver. And so start on that path early on. And the good way to do that is by attending sessions that are readily available on the internet from a variety of different writing organizations that talk about pathways to publishing. And become a good literary citizen. There's so many great writing organizations out there, like for women writers, the Women's National Book Association, various writing associations in local communities and states, and also national organizations. For historical novels, there's the Historical Novel Society, and there's just so many different places out there to form friendships and to get support, because you really do need those cheerleaders to help get over the finish line.
Thank you, Connie. And the reason why we're talking a bit here, we, the panel, met a bit earlier, is because we do encourage that storytelling. We do encourage folks in the audience who believe that their families' stories are worth telling to spread the word and to honor the folks who have been through these events or who have feelings that they'd like to share. We do have in Alden an already published author from the journals that I mentioned, but Alden, a question for you. Why did you choose to write Two Nails, One Love as fiction?
Before that, I want to comment on something that Kimiko said that it really resonated with me, how the initial feedback for your manuscript was that the main character was hard to, was a bit removed from the, that was the exact same comment I had for my manuscript. And Kimiko, I don't know if it's because our parents have, because of the trauma, that they look at what happened to them from a kind of removed lens, and therefore we see it that way, and we write about it that way. I don't know, and but that was the comment that I got repeatedly, was that why are you keeping the reader at arm's length from your characters? And at first I thought it was because I mainly wrote nonfiction up to that point, and this was my first time writing fiction and all. But I think what you said is very true, and it just really resonated with me. I'm sorry, the question, why? Fiction for me, because my mother's story was just too complex to capture and to do nonfiction, because she has 9 siblings, and actually 4 were Kibe. And Ken, one of her brothers was stuck in Japan when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. He got drafted by the Imperial Japanese Army, and he ended up fighting and died in combat, while another of my mother's brother in Hawaii had volunteered for the 100th Battalion, and he fought in Italy. So it was really a story of brothers on opposite ends of the war. Thankfully, they weren't fighting, in the same continent. That is a complicated story that sort of deserved its own novel. And it kind of detracted from what I wanted to say in this novel about what happened to my mother. So in the novel, the mother character only has 2 siblings. I just found it I had to kind of condense it to try to get to the essential truth of what I was trying to say in this novel, which is similar to, I think, what Kimiko, you were, said in yours about the intergenerational trauma, how this is passed down. That was my story. And so everything else that sort of detracted from that, I got rid of. And in my novel, the narrator is an only child. I actually have 3 brothers, but I, deleted them just to get to the more essential, story of this. So, that's why fiction, just to, simplify.
Alden, thank you for those comments and commenting on Kimiko's work as well. It sounds like those were unexpected for you, or did you, when you went into this project, did you anticipate having to remove certain of your brothers, sisters?
No, I wanted to write nonfiction. I just, because I've only written nonfiction in my life. I've worked at, Scientific American, the Harvard Business Review. That's what I do. I write nonfiction. But this was just too complicated. And I joke with my friends. I said at one point, I felt like I was writing a Russian novel, with all my mother's siblings and what happened to them. And it was just too unwieldy for me. And I thought I was losing my main message. So yeah, that's why.
Interesting. So you somewhat anticipated that. Sofia, I'm going to turn to you about unexpected discoveries. Did you have any unexpected discoveries while you were writing, and why were they unexpected?
So I'll definitely answer that, but I want to say something about missing brothers. I get a lot of flack because my baby brother isn't on the cover, so I should just mention that there's another one of us. He didn't make the cut. He wasn't born yet, so I understand about disappearing brothers and getting flack for it. So unexpected discoveries. What I didn't understand, I'll say something about the Japanese internment, and then I'll say something about sort of the broader story. I didn't understand, and I was just telling Kimiko this morning, I knew about the Japanese internment, not through school, through my own research, but I didn't understand the depth of dispossession. I didn't understand how important it was, how important Japanese farmers were to American agriculture at the time of the internment. I didn't understand how much capital the community had. And I didn't understand the intentionality of the dispossession. I also didn't understand what happened after the internment. I didn't understand the seeming intentionality of, and the sort of forced assimilation component of scattering people from one consolidated community all over the country, and what that meant for family ties. What's interesting about that in the context of the larger story to me is that it remained consistent in different groups. As I told the stories of the 12 towns, it really could have been that the stories didn't connect to one another, that they were 12 distinct stories, and it read like a series of essays, but it didn't. What happened was that when I was done, I laid out a timeline, and what I was looking at was an unbroken legacy of the forced migration and dispossession of brown and black populations that is American history. End to end, these stories fit together like a puzzle. And when I put the stories on a map and I included the towns that were implicated in each of the stories, it went border to border and coast to coast. This is the story of America, this dispossession and the forced migration of our communities to the margins. And so there were some things that came up over and over again in these different stories about different color lines all over America. Family separation, dispossession, repeated assaults, forced assimilation. They came up whether I was talking about Indian residential schools, whether I was talking about mining exploits on reservations, whether I was talking about the forced breeding of enslaved Americans. The same themes came up over and over again. And that's not to flatten our experiences. We all have very distinct experiences, but there was something remarkably intentional about the consistency of those elements and those strategies. And it made me feel like we really need to confront that history and the consistency of those strategies and hold our country to the values that it so sort of readily espouses from the podiums, right? Freedom, justice, liberty. These are things that we have to really insist on for our communities.
Sofia, as you turn the mic back over, thank you. I'm just going to keep it with you for a second because you said a few things that spark my next question here about writing the novel. Was it healing for you? Was it cathartic? Was it? I can feel your energy right now. And so, what was it like? What did you hope to convey in your book?
That's a really great question. So it was incredibly cathartic. I tell people it was like 10 years of therapy all the time. Because after, it's part memoir, and the memoir is braided. So I tell my experience in each of those 12 towns, because it turns out I'm a different race depending on where in the country I am, and what I'm wearing, and who I'm standing next to. So if I'm with my parents who speak with an accent, I'm not white, I'm foreign. If I have a hijab on, I'm much darker than I am suddenly. If I'm with my husband, I don't pass because my husband, although he's Pakistani, is much darker than I am. If I'm in Florida at college wearing a sundress, I'm white. It was so that was really profoundly interesting to me personally, and so that was, I got to sort of excavate a lot of my own life. But the other piece that happened was that my family had an opportunity to move to Canada, and we took it because my daughter was quite ill, and we needed to sort of not have the anxiety of the assault on the Muslim community be quite so present, so we could take care of her. And so one of the things that I learned was that other countries with similar history, so many of you probably know that Canada also had an internment, and Canada was also founded on the colonization and the assault against Native people. And so what's been interesting is to learn that Canada, and hopeful, is that Canada is taking a very different approach to decolonization, a very sort of mindful approach. And if you go to the Department of Justice website today for Canada, it's the state that's declaring the intention to decolonize and to make reconciliation with brown and black communities that have faced these assaults. So that's been really important to learn about.
Thank you, Sofia. And why don't we pass that down to Kimiko, because my next question for Kimiko is along those same lines of cathartism and the feelings, the deep feelings. Your book is a lot about the trauma, intergenerational trauma. Would you comment on that and how you brought that to the fore for your readers?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of whether it was healing or not, could I address that too?
Sure.
I think I didn't think going into writing it that it would be so healing, but I definitely feel that after the course of writing it, which took me a long time, it took me 8 years from start, because my younger daughter, Kayla, my daughters are there, Mariko and Kayla, and Kayla was 1 when I started, and then it came out during the pandemic in 2020. So, but afterwards, I definitely feel this like lighter sense. I'm writing my second novel now, and it's much more playful and lighthearted. So I think that, you know, consciously and unconsciously writing the novel, it's fiction, you know, it's not trying to be absolutely historically accurate. But it was sort of this the creative process, I think, really did help me to work through a lot of that trauma that I felt had been inherited. Without really, you know, realizing it afterwards. I'm kind of seeing that now in my second novel, not feeling the need to work through some of those same issues. Was that addressing the questions?
Thank you, Kimiko. You know, you mentioned historical accuracy, and Alden, this next question is for you about historical accuracy, and then I'll ask the same question of Connie, the research that went into that. But Alden, what resources did you use to ensure that historical accuracy was grounded that in your novel?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because my novel is, like yours, based on historical events. And one of the events that not many people know about, and a lot of historians do not know about, was that there was a exchange of essentially civilian prisoners during World War II. And my mother's family got roped into this. So in 1943, in the middle of the war, they were sent on a ship from New York to Japan to be exchanged for Americans who had been stuck in Japan, China, when the war broke out. This is a really ugly subchapter of a really ugly chapter in US history. And when I told a friend about this in Boston, and he mentioned it to his friend, who is a Harvard professor of history, who didn't know it happened. And so he asked my friend, you know, are you sure? I told my friend, okay, this is something, if my mother were to lie about it, she would lie that it didn't happen. She wouldn't lie and make this up. I mean, she was on this exchange ship. And I was able to find someone who did his dissertation at the University of Kansas in 1983, I think it was, on these two exchanges. See, what happened was, you know, when the war broke out, there were people stuck on the wrong side. There were a lot of Japanese businessmen, you know, and people who worked at the embassies, et cetera, here. But there were a lot of US citizens stuck not only in Japan, but in China, you know, Philippines, Hong Kong. And a lot of these were missionary families. And of course, you know, they wanted to return to the US. There were two exchanges, and I think the first one was on the up and up, where you had people, you know, participants who both, you know, wanted to be on this exchange. The problem was the second exchange, because there were more US citizens stuck in Japan and Asia than there were Japanese nationals who were stuck here in the US. So somewhere along the line, you know, it was decided that, you know, why don't we throw in these Issei, you know, and their families. So, you know, my mother and her family was, you know, officially repatriated to Japan, even though my mother had never been to Japan, you know, but they got roped into this exchange. So yeah, I definitely use that, his dissertation a lot, because he had gained access to a lot of recently, at the time, declassified documents. Also, the Densho website is a wealth of information. I can't speak highly enough of it. It's a wealth. They also have information on these civilian prisoner exchanges. So yeah, I can't recommend it highly enough. If you're going to be writing anything that taps back into, you know, World War II history, or, you know, just Japanese American Nikkei history and culture, the Densho website.
Thank you, Alden. Connie, how about you? Hold the mic.
This way. Okay, good. So, Of White Ashes is structured along the events of history, and getting those events accurate were really important to Kent and me. We consulted about 120 different sources, both all books, articles, library resources, both online and within the four walls of a library. We traveled to where Kent's parents experienced these events. We stood where they stood. We were in Hiroshima, across the river from the rifle factory where his 16-year-old dad was when Hiroshima was bombed. We visited Kent's mom's island of Kauai and her town of Waimea, and we're within the Buddhist temple where Kent's grandfather was the minister, and his picture is still on the wall. He was arrested the day after Pearl Harbor. One of the most profound researching experiences for us was at the National Archives in Washington when we pulled the files of Kent's family and held his grandfather's arrest warrant in our hands and saw the documentation that, in fact, the dossier on him had been completed in July of 1941. And if all of you were at the session yesterday where Sarah Sims and Haley Johnson from Louisiana State were talking, and they shared these resources that are increasingly becoming available, which is terrific. It's just remarkable to, if it's your family or your husband's family, to see the proof of what happened. You hear what happened, you've been told what happened, but this is seeing the proof of what happened as they were articulating yesterday. And Kent's mom wrote things down. She, about 15 years before she died, she presented Kent and each of his siblings with a binder. It was family pictures. It was a narrative of the family history. And she held on to things from camp, her yearbook from Tule Lake, her autograph book, which was made out of wood and held together with rawhide shoestrings. And within it were these beautiful sentiments from her friends. And so all of those things went into making sure that we went through these periods of history and told things the way that they happened and how we imagine it may have felt to have lived through that period of time.
Great, thank you. We are approaching 10 o'clock, and I want to certainly allow time for those in the audience. I do also want to add to what Connie said, yesterday's session, Rising Above Arkansas, which had that website, was just a tremendous resource for those of you who are in attendance and who will make the time to go to that website. At least I intend to, and I know Connie will as well. We spoke with somebody else who I don't see, at least in the audience, who said that maybe it's possible to zoom right in on the barracks where your relatives were, and so I encourage that. Let's see, show of hands, who has a question, and we'll direct the microphone here to whoever the question is directed. No questions? I find that hard to believe. Oh, there's one in the back.
Yeah, I think this is a question that Alden answered already, but I would be curious for the rest of you.
Thanks. I think this is a question that Alden answered already, but I guess for Kimiko and then for the two of you, why fiction? You know, you're talking about the historical research that went into it, but ultimately chose to write fiction rather than memoir or something else. So can you talk a little bit about what the genre allowed you to do that maybe something else wouldn't have? And Alden, if you want to add more, please do.
Thank you. We'll start with Kimiko and then go to Connie and Alden for any adds.
Thank you. Great question. I think for me, when I was speaking earlier about my own experience of camp was very fragmented and sort of surreal. One of my favorite novels of all time is Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. And why I love it so much is how he uses the absurd and surreality to sort of approach the trauma of war. Because as I was saying earlier, trauma isn't experienced in a linear way because it's incomprehensible because the incomprehensible is happening, especially from a child's perspective, which was what I was trying to capture. So for me, I wasn't so interested just personally in trying to historically represent what happened. I leave that to others who are better at that than I. So I wanted to tell it through more of a surreal lens, more of a poetic lens. Also, I come from dance theater, which is very surreal and more sort of emotionally driven and more dreamlike, I suppose, which for me I think captures truth in a way that I feel a factual narrative can't. So that's why I chose fiction.
Great. Connie, why fiction?
As I mentioned earlier, we thought that the book would be written as a nonfiction book by someone else, or a documentary film produced by someone else. But when we decided to take on the project, we thought it was really important to place our value on our relationships with Kent's brother and sister above everything in telling the story. And even if we were to have written the book as nonfiction, a narrative nonfiction, we would have needed to have given life to these people, which required us to talk about their personalities and how they may have handled something in a way that we didn't know how they handled it. It was more how we imagined that they handled it. And so we knew that if we said anything negative against mom and dad, it would be problematic for our relationship within the family, and those relationships are just too important to not honor. And so that's why it's fiction.
Sofia, did you want to comment?
Sure. So my book is actually nonfiction. It's memoir and history, and it's deeply cited. So if you go onto sofiaelicon.com, there are 60 to 100 pages of endnotes. Everything is thoroughly cited. That was really important to me because I'm always arguing with my dad in my head, and so I need to cite everything. But interestingly, my next book in the works now is fiction, because there are certain, I really, what you said really resonated, Kimiko. There are certain ideas that it's difficult to explore within the constraints of citing every fact. And there is a place that you can go to in fiction, I think, where you can be true to the essence of those facts, but sort of build a reality around them that I think can be evocative for sometimes a much larger range of folks who maybe don't feel themselves connected to that history before they read the story. So I really, really appreciate what you both said about it.
Great.
I would like to just tag on to what I said earlier, and that is, a lot of people don't like to read nonfiction, but they love to read historical fiction. And so that was another reason for fictionizing this story, so that hopefully the readers, as they move through the pages, will really feel what it may have felt like to have experienced these events, and change hearts and minds, create more empathy for our very divided world, and be a little more kind when faced with differences, a little less divisive.
Well said. We are running out of time, and so what I'd like to do is ask each of the panelists. We'll start, Alden, with you, then Kimiko, Sofia, Connie, and then as moderator, I reserve the right to have the last word. Last word. So, Alden, whatever you want. It's an open-ended question. What would you like to share with our audience who are here today, where we have this great opportunity to speak with folks?
I want to encourage people to write about their own families, or to record some of the history. When I've talked about to other Nikkei, who want to write, I tell them this. I think our community, it's like this huge tapestry. And one of the things that made it difficult for me to write was that I felt initially like I had to cover a lot of this tapestry, and to sort of be true to the whole Nikkei experience. But no, all I had to do was cover my little section of that tapestry. And Kimiko, you've covered, your section, and Connie and Kent, you've covered your section. And I think if enough of us write or do these oral histories that Densho records, we can fill in more of the tapestry, because it's a very rich, complex tapestry. Our experiences, our parents, in Hawaii is very different than the West Coast experience, and there were Nikkei, in the Midwest or in the East Coast, and some went to camp, some didn't, it's just very complex, a lot. There's a Kibe experience of kids, who were Nisei, who were sent to Japan. It's a very rich, complex tapestry, and it's huge. So if we, so please write your family stories, or somehow, you don't have to necessarily publish it, but write it for your children and their children, because this is important. And it's not only our community's history. I feel like this is US history, especially as pertains to World War II and what happened to our community then. So please write, please record, please capture this.
Yeah, I really resonate with what all of you have been saying today, and especially with what Alden just said. I feel like if all of us, value our stories and tell our stories, and really cherish our elders, who are with us, to hear those stories firsthand. And I also want to say that the Densho website was a huge resource for me as well. And I think, one thing I wanted to say was, for our family, and I think for the Japanese American community in general, the reparations were very meaningful. I noticed a shift in the family of being willing, some of my elder family members being more willing to talk about camp after it was sort of publicly acknowledged and the injustice was formally acknowledged. So I personally feel that for our country to heal, there's so much, division and violence, and for our country to be founded on such violence without formally acknowledging that, taking steps for reparations for others who were wronged, for formerly enslaved people, for indigenous people. I think that's a huge part of this larger healing that our country needs to do, and finding those patterns, as Sofia's book points out, and not seeing ourselves as, divided communities. Of course, unique communities, yes, but sort of seeing those larger patterns and healing at a larger scale, I think, is so important. And I think, this pilgrimage that, you're organizing, Kimiko, and Tsudu Solidarity, the work that you're doing, all of this is just so important. So I feel really honored to be here amongst you all who already, value that. So thank you.
So I'll just say two things. As an outsider to Japanese American community, I just want to say you have something really special going on here. I'm so grateful to be part of this event, and Kimiko and Aaron, you really have made something magical. I've rarely been in a group of people so consistently kind, open, just really lovely as you all, and I really feel very grateful to be a little part of this. The other thing I'd say just echoes what Alden and Kimiko said, which is that your stories are for other communities very powerful. When the registry of Muslim men began on the East Coast, not far from where I was living at the time, I was a newly minted lawyer, and I felt really helpless in many ways. And it was to the stories of communities like yours that we turned to say, what does this mean? What do we need to be aware of? What could happen? How do we need to defend ourselves? And so the sharing of your stories is powerful, not only for all of you together, but really for communities outside of the Japanese American community. And I think those connections between our communities is going to be what really changes the fabric of America, so that it is always and consistently as much ours as anyone else's. So I just want to express gratitude also for all of you who have shared stories over this last couple of days. They're really powerful, and I carry them with me into my own community.
everyone said. I really do want to express my gratitude to the elders for sharing your stories yesterday, for talking with Kent and me individually. You are so remarkable. Thank you for being here, for opening your stories to all of us. They really matter. And I hope that the younger generation that's here, and this was mentioned yesterday, it's so important for you to let all of this soak in and carry it forward as the people who have a responsibility to share these stories in the future, and to pull those stories out of your family in whatever way you can. And sometimes it takes different paths to get there. And also, I'm so grateful to Kimiko and Aaron and all of the volunteers for bringing all of us together. This has been a wonderful couple of days.
So my final remarks, and again, I use my prerogative as moderator to thank the JAMP organization. And yes, I can name folks, but I think you know who you are. I'm looking at Kimiko now, looking at Aaron. I don't see Nicole. Julie, I see over there. So thank you all for doing that. Connie and I are so committed to the pilgrimage. We've been to Tule Lake as well. And this is somewhat of a plug, but it's really a plug for JAMP. We are donating a percentage of our proceeds of the sale of our novel to JAMP. We want JAMP to live on for the great work that it does and for bringing people together like we are here today. So thank you, JAMP. Thank you, everybody here today who made the effort to come here. We'll get our picture, we'll conclude the panel, and make our way to the lobby. And our next program begins at 11 o'clock. Thank you, everybody.